Hello, and welcome to the Minnesota Department of Education's presentation of Minnesota Standardized English Learner Procedures.
Today's presentation will be hosted by Barbara AlNouri and Michelle Niska. We are education specialists at the Minnesota Department of Education, and we are excited to present to you today. We would like to highlight for you the 10 Minnesota commitments to equity. Number 1, prioritize equity. Number 2, start from within. Number 3, measure what matters. Number 4, go local. Number 5, follow the money. Number 6, start early. Number 7, monitor implementation of standards. Number 8, value people. Number 9, improve conditions for learning. And number 10, give students options. In this presentation, our highlight is around prioritizing equity. We have several goals to discuss with you today. They are an overview of standardized procedures. We'll also discuss the language instruction educational program. We'll go over the process for identification and using the Minnesota Language Survey. We will talk about program entrance and using the state purchase subscription to TransAct for parent notification. And finally, we will discuss exiting services through the use of annual assessments. Several procedures have been adjusted or altered for the 2020-21 school year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We will highlight those changes throughout this presentation with the small C19 scroll on the appropriate topic slides as we present today.
Before we begin discussing the standardized procedures, I'd like to take a few minutes and discuss the latest amendment to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. In 2015, President Obama signed into law the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. The ESSA amendment replaced the No Child Left Behind, or NCLB. This amendment made very important changes for federal programs. Some of these changes affected all students, but some of them only affected English learners. First, the use of the term Limited English Proficiency, or LEP, was replaced with the term English Learner, or EL. The required parent notification of a student's placement into the English language development that was a requirement in No Child Left Behind in Title III, under ESSA, moved to Title I. Additionally, the Minnesota Department of Education, working with a variety of stakeholders, proposed several changes to the MCAs and the accountability of the English learner group. Perhaps the largest change for Minnesota districts was the adoption of statewide entry and exit procedures and criteria. With the rollout of these statewide standardized criteria and procedures, in July of 2017, all Minnesota districts must have the same identical Minnesota language surveys, assessment entry and exit criteria and procedures, and additional criteria. The Language Instruction Educational Program, or LIEP, is a requirement for all school districts, regardless if the district has enrolled students with an English learner status. Having a plan in place or ready to go enables districts to begin serving students needing English language development as soon as they are enrolled. Each language instruction educational program must have a minimum 3 critical points. These points have been brought out in various court decisions. First, the curriculum and program must be based upon sound educational theory. Second, the language instruction educational program must have reasonable resources dedicated to the program to ensure effective implementation and positive outcomes. Finally, the LIEP must be evaluated and adjusted as needed.
On the Minnesota Department of Education webpage, you will find many documents detailing the components of the Minnesota Standardized English Learner Procedures. The webpage holds many guidance documents and flowcharts to further explain the policies and procedures related to the identification, entrance, continuing eligibility, and exit of English learners in an English language development program.
Based upon the standardized procedures, this flowchart illustrates the three main steps that have been standardized in the Minnesota ESSA state plan. The first is English learner identification, entrance into a language instruction educational program, and exit from EL programming. The first step, identification, begins when parents complete a Minnesota language survey, which identifies if their student has a home language other than English. Districts then follow up by using an authorized, age-appropriate screen assessment. Once a student is determined eligible for EL program support, based upon the results of the screener, the student is placed or entered into the Language Instruction Educational Program, or EL program. Scores from the annual WIDA assessment access test are used to determine continuing eligibility or exit from the EL development. Additional criteria may be used to retain a student in EL program instruction, but only if certain criteria are met. In the identification process, all students must have a completed Minnesota Language Survey, or MNLS, filled out by a parent or guardian. The MNLS is available on TransAct.com, which Michelle will discuss later in the presentation. The Minnesota Language Survey asks the parent or guardian to complete 4 statements. My student first learned. My student speaks. My student understands. My student has constant interaction in. The parent has 3 different responses for each statement: a language other than English, English and languages other than English, only English. In the third box, the parent is asked to list the languages other than English that the student understands. If a parent indicates a language other than English in a response to any of the 4 statements, the student must be screened for English language proficiency. If no language other than English is reported, the district continues the enrollment process. All students who have a Minnesota Language Survey other than English must be screened by the age-appropriate screener. The age-appropriate screener is based on the student's grade level. For kindergarten and first semester of first grade, either the WIDA WAPT or the model test may be used. For students in the second semester of first grade to 12th grade, the student must take the WIDA screener. The WIDA screener is offered in 2 different versions, online or paper. Using these results, the district must determine if the student is to be identified as an English learner. This is a chart that identifies the kindergarten screener criteria. This can also be used for first semester of first grade. If a student is in pre-kindergarten or first semester of kindergarten, the student only takes the listening and speaking part of either the WAPT or the kindergarten model. If a student receives 27 or below in listening and speaking, the student is eligible to receive English language development. If a first semester kindergarten student takes the model, the student must have a composite score below 5 or a score of below 4 in either listening or speaking to be eligible for ELD. In the second semester of kindergarten, as well as the first semester of first grade, the student should complete all 4 domains, listening, speaking, and reading and writing, in one of the 2 tests. They must complete the entire test. If the student is participating in the kindergarten WAPT, they must have a score in listening and speaking below 28, or in reading below 11, or in writing below 12 to qualify for ELD. If a student takes the kindergarten model, again taking all 4 domains, the composite score must be below a 5 or a score below 4 in one of the 4 domains to qualify for English language development. Please note that WIDA is in the process of completing the development of a kindergarten screener. As more information is available, the Minnesota Department of Education will disseminate this information. For students in second semester first grade to 12th grade, the student must take the WIDA screener. This test is presented in 2 different versions, an online test and a paper test. The online test is free to any Minnesota district. No matter how the student takes the test, the student is considered eligible for ELD if their overall composite score is below 4.5 or if any domain is below 4.0. Students are not eligible for English language development if their composite score is 4.5 or higher and each domain is 4.0 or higher. The information on the next few slides is information that is only available, only able to be used during COVID-19 distance learning and the 2020-2021 school year. This is not Minnesota's standardized procedures except for the 2020-2021 school year. The first step, as we did outline above, is you will go ahead and administer the Minnesota Home Language Survey, the MNLS, to all newly enrolling students and parents. Again, the survey is found under the user's account in the TransAct Parent Notification Portal for Minnesota that Michelle will be discussing later in the presentation. Using a former ELP screener or a temporary identification tool to determine if a student whose primary home language is not English will benefit from EL programming in 2020-2021. The district must make a placement decision when the in-person, remote, or provisional identification process is completed. If a provisional identification tool is used, the student will need to be screened in person or using the LOS remote screener. Again, let me repeat that. If a provisional identification tool is used, the student will need to be screened in person when that becomes available or use the LOS remote screener. Districts should decide locally if in-person ELP screening can be completed during any of the 3 learning modes. The Minnesota Department of Health public health guidelines must be followed, and students, staff, and families in at-risk categories should not act inconsistently with public health recommendations or the advice of their medical providers. For the 2021 school year only, the Lost Links online ELP screener can be used remotely as a former screening option. If the district chooses to do this, there is no need to rescreen to verify English learner status later. If a student has a proficiency level of either 4 or 5 and a reading score 4 or higher and a writing score 4 or higher, the student is considered proficient and would not qualify for English language instruction. Provisional identification for temporary EL programming. Remember, this is only to be used during the 2020-2021 school year during the COVID-19 pandemic only. First and foremost, remember that if provisional identification is used, former identification must take place once in-person screening is feasible. I'm going to repeat that. Formal identification must take place once in-person screening is feasible. There are 3 different options that the Minnesota Department of Education has put forth to be used for temporary EL status. The first one is to use the WIDA remote screener. The second is the parent interview process. This is described on page 5 of Identifying Students for English Learner Status During Distance Learning, which is located on the English Learner webpage on the Minnesota Department of Education's website. The third is to use the Council of Great City Schools, Assessing Language Proficiency During Extended School Closures. It provides sample questionnaires across the grade bands. If a student qualifies for ELD, English Language Development, using the temporary EL identification, MARS should be updated with EL Yes for the student. And we'll discuss MARS later in the presentation, but note if a student has been temporarily identified as an English learner, the MARS data element should be EL equal yes. To continue with the provisional identification for temporary EL programming that is only applicable to the 2020-2021 school year, if the formal ELP screening is completed once the district has either used the LOS online screener or has formally tested the student in the age-appropriate WIDA screener, the new status for that student must be reported. So if the student's status changes after a formal identification screener, the data element in MARS must be changed from EL equal yes to EL equal no. For example, if the formal ELP screener shows that the student is no longer eligible for EL status, the MARS record must be retroactively changed from EL yes to EL no. None of the student's records would show an EL start date. Just as parent notification occurs under the typical or regular Minnesota standardized procedures, there's also parent notification required in the 2020-2021 school year. Initially, the parent notification should come within 10 business days of enrollment in the language instruction educational program. And then a parent notification also comes within 30 calendar days of the beginning of the school year for continuing students. This would be based on the student's spring access score. And Michelle will discuss that later in the presentation as well. In 2020-2021 only, the U.S. Department of Education said that after the start of the school year, in other words, after the first 30 days, districts and charter schools have an additional 30 days to identify students for EL programming. Districts then have an additional 14 calendar days in which to notify parents of EL programming.
According to state and federal laws, parent notification must be handled in a specific way. According to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the parent notice and information provided to parents shall be in an understandable and uniform format, and, to the extent practicable, provided in a language that parents can understand. Additionally, according to Minnesota state statute, parent notification must be made by mail. These laws make it clear that parent notification made by delivering letters at parent-teacher conferences, delivering the letters with the child to take home, or delivering letters electronically will not completely follow the law in our state. TransAct is an online subscription website paid for by the Minnesota Department of Education. Anyone can create an account using their school or district email to access federally required and other helpful translated resources free of charge. TransAct has recently upgraded their platform experience. So, if you have used TransAct in the past and have not updated your account, it is important to do that in 2020 because the old platform will discontinue at the end of the year. To update your account and access the new platform, please email TransAct directly at support@transact.com. Once your account has been updated, you can access the new platform at https://minnesota-doe.parentnotices.com. TransAct not only holds federally required translated letters, TransAct also contains other important information, such as letters for homeless and foster care programs, early learning resources, the Minnesota Language Survey, and translated signs you can post around school to help parents, students, and community members locate the offices and help they need in their home language. Once you log into the updated platform to find important federally required parent notices, look at the left side menu to find the Parent Notices collection. Then you can select ESEA, then EL programs for Title I and Title III. Then to locate the English Learner Program Placement letter, select the letter labeled EL-02 from the list. On the site, after you select the EL-02 English Learner Program Placement document, there are several little icons positioned next to the name of the letter. By selecting those little icons, you can open the letter, fill in and send the letter, or print the letter. Please remember that if you choose to send the letter to parents electronically, Minnesota law requires you to also send the letter by mail. So it is important to note that sending the letter only electronically will not be sufficient to meet the law. The Minnesota Department of Education, along with several stakeholders, has set statewide criteria to determine a student's need for English Language Development Program eligibility using the required WIDA Access Assessment. Based upon a student's Access Assessment score, the student will either demonstrate a continued need for the English Language Development Program, or the student will demonstrate the proficiency on the assessment and will be exited from the program and monitored. We will discuss assessment scores and how those relate to making a decision on program eligibility over the next several slides. In the scenario illustrated on this slide, a student receives a composite score of at least 4.5, and all domains of listening, speaking, reading, and writing scores are at least 3.5. If this is the situation with a student, the school or district should exit the student from English Language Development Instruction, notify parents of the exit, change the status of the student in MARS to EL No, and monitor the student for the next 2 years. In the scenario illustrated on this slide, a student receives a composite score of at least 4.5 and only one domain of listening, speaking, reading, or writing is less than 3.5. Any evidence or data collected may show that the student is proficient in the domain where the score is below 3.5. If no collected data shows that this student needs additional language support in the area below 3.5, the student should exit the English Language Development Program. Data collected can include evidence that the student is successful in core content classes without a need for additional language support in that lower domain, and if the student has a disability, a consultation with the student's IEP team to ensure that English language development support is no longer needed. In the case where evidence indicates that the student is proficient, the school or district should exit the student from EL instruction. The school or district should also notify parents of the exit, change the status of the student in MARS to EL No, and monitor the student for the next 2 years. In the scenario illustrated on this slide, a student receives a composite score of at least 4.5 and only one domain of listening, speaking, reading, or writing is less than 3.5, and this time the data collected shows that the student is not proficient in the domain where the score is below 3.5. Data collected should include evidence that the student is not yet successful in core content classes because of a need for additional language support, especially in that lower domain. If the student has a disability, it is important to consult with the student's IEP team to decide if continued English language instruction would benefit the student. In this scenario, the school or district should consult with the parents to ensure that student needs are met, maintain the student's EL status in MARS, and ensure that the student remains in English language development programming. It is also important to keep the data demonstrating a continued need for English language development services in a student's cumulative record or file. In the scenario illustrated on this slide, a student receives a composite score that is less than 4.5 and or 2 or more domain scores of listening, speaking, reading, and writing are less than 3.5. In this instance, the student should maintain eligibility in MARS, the student should continue to remain eligible for English language development instruction, and parents should be notified of their child's eligibility annually.
This slide contains a chart for the MARS data entry requirements. There are 3 different MARS data points that must be entered for each enrolling student in a district. The first one, actually the first 2, occur during the identification stage. The first element within the identification stage is the student's home primary language. You will use a code that is available from MARS to identify and mark the student's home language. Note that this does not change for the entire career of the student unless a mistake was made. The student's home primary language does not change even once a student becomes proficient. Also, keep in mind that a student cannot have a home primary language of English and be eligible for English language services. The second data point that's entered during the identification period is the EL indicator. A student either is a yes if the student is able to participate in English language development, or no if a student does not qualify for English language development. During the entrance period, a third data element needs to be entered, and that is the EL start date. This is when the student first starts the language instruction educational plan. In the third stage, or exit, the EL indicator becomes no. But remember, to exit, the student must have the access criteria as Michelle discussed earlier. There is no EL start date because the student no longer is eligible for participation in English language development, and the home primary language is already entered.
In a situation where parents have refused English language development services, there are a few important points that a school or district should note. A school district is required by civil rights laws to provide services to students that will help the student become proficient in English and succeed academically. Schools or districts must also annually notify parents that their child is eligible for English language development programming, even if parents refuse the programming each year. Schools or districts are required to obtain a signed refusal letter each year that the child qualifies for English language development programming. Students are still required to participate in the annual access assessment. Of course, parents may also refuse annual testing by following the school or district's procedure on testing opt-out. If you have further questions after our presentation, please feel free to contact Barbara AlNouri at barbara.alnouri@state.mn.us or Michelle Niska at michelle.niska@state.mn.us.
For additional information concerning English learners during the 2020-2021 school year, go to the English Learner webpage on the Minnesota Department of Education's website.
Thank you very much for watching our presentation today. We hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.